I shouldn't interfere in the federal election. Last time I checked, Pierre Poilievre never came out in our election. Matter of fact, him or one of his lieutenants told every one of his members, don't you dare go out and help the PCs. Isn't that ironic?
Why is there so much bad blood between you and the federal party? And how does the federal party start to build bridges now within the conservative movement as they look to the next 2, 3, 4 years?
Well, all they have to do is make a phone call. I like a lot of the MPs, but the people spoke, and they spoke loud and clear.
That's Ontario Premier Doug Ford earlier today when asked why his progressive Conservatives didn't publicly support federal Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre during the election campaign. Tensions between the two sides have been known for some time. Nova Scotia Premier Tim Houston also had his own criticism for Poilievre and the party's election results. Take a listen.
Were you unable to work with him in a certain capacity?
I don't think Riff would be I didn't have a relationship with him. I don't have a relationship with him. I think there'll be some lessons learned from this campaign. I think the Conservative Party of Canada was very good at pushing people away, not so good at pulling people in, and I think that they probably saw that in some of the results they had across the country. I hope they do some soul searching on what they believe it means to be a Conservative.
Those comments come as questions continue on what comes next for Pierre Poilievre after he lost his seat. One Conservative campaign source tells CTV News he's making calls to the grassroots like always and that party members want to see him in the House of Commons, saying, quote, he will get a seat. With more on this, let's bring in our front bench. Sharon Carr is former Deputy Chief of Staff to former Finance Minister Bill Morneau. She's now a partner at Sovereign Advisory and did advise the Liberal campaign. Jamie Ellerton is a Conservative strategist and the founder and principal of Canaptus. Former interim NDP National Director Carl Belanger is with us. He's now the president of Traction Strategies. And Hannah Thibodeau is a former news anchor. She's now an executive communications officer at Global Public Affairs. Hi, everybody. Good to see you tonight. Post-election discussion on tap. Hannah, I'll start with you. Those comments from the premiers are very interesting. I put them directly to Andrew Scheer, the former leader of the party. He heard them, and we went back and forth quite a bit. The counter from the Conservatives is, we have more support than we did before. So the criticism from Ford and in particular Houston about pushing people away rather than pulling people in, they're fighting back against that. And Mr. Scheer did, certainly by arguing like, look, we actually got more votes in Ontario than Doug Ford was his contention. We increased our vote share overall quite substantially from the last election. What do you make of the push from the premiers and the pushback from Mr. Scheer?
So much to dig into there, Vashi. Let me just start by saying that was a big loss, though, for Pierre Poilievre to a government that was essentially a write-off just 2 months ago. And that's something I didn't hear from Andrew Scheer in your interview. And I think those are the types of things that maybe that humble voice needs to come through a bit more when speaking about the loss. Now, you talk about the fact, and I heard Mr. Scheer talk about this too, is that they were up in the popular vote. Well, let's look back on the past two campaigns, the one that was run by Andrew Scheer, the one that was run by Mr. O'Toole in the last two election campaigns. The popular vote was also increased by those two leaders. Where are those two leaders now? They're not leading that party. So there's a couple of facts as well. To give Mr. Poilievre credit, I do hear what Mr. Scheer is saying is that he chased out a prime minister. He was able to get rid of the carbon tax because although Mark Carney takes credit for it, this is something that Mr. Poilievre and his team really pushed hard to do. But history isn't going to be kind to Mr. Poilievre because of the fact that the ballot box question changed. It changed to Donald Trump, and he and his team did not pivot to that message. So whether he's able to get that support from his people across the country, we already see that the knives are out. And that is because he hasn't, and his team hasn't always been kind to people like Premier Tim Houston, like Premier Doug Ford, who both had and gained massive majorities in their election campaigns.
Well, even within the interview, there was a bit of a migration, right? You could tell Carl initially Mr. Scheer was really put off by those comments, but then, a few minutes later was saying we just need to all put aside these differences and work together as Conservatives, almost like making an appeal to do so. Is that necessary? Do there need to be overtures from the federal wing of the party to premiers like Premier Houston and Premier Ford, or the other way around, I guess?
Well, it's much easier in politics to win if you can add people to your cause than if you subtract them. And in this campaign, clearly Doug Ford and his team were offside, and so was Tim Houston's. And there were many conservatives, or progressive conservatives, I should say, that are not comfortable and were not comfortable and might never be comfortable with the kind of conservatism that Pierre Poilievre ran on. So the key here is, where do you go to broaden your appeal? Because if you're counting on somehow the NDP to come back and steal votes from the Liberals so you can win, that might not work. The party's in pretty bad shape. So where do you go as Conservatives to go from the 40-41% ceiling that you've hit to go to 47, 48, 49, maybe 50%? Brian Mulroney used to do it. So where's the path? And that's where, you have to reach out to the progressive Conservatives, because they've won, they know how to win, and they can help you out.
Sharon, what's your thoughts on that? Because I do remember a lot of pushback from people after Aaron O'Toole. Like they said, that's what Aaron O'Toole tried to do. It didn't work, so why should we try?
Well, I think sometimes the idea of having a big tent is great. Every party, I think, tries to have a balance of that. But sometimes when your tent is so big that you alienate people that would be more, I would say, on the reasonable conservative front, and kind of try to pander a bit more to the more right-leaning, kind of borderline, or even dipping into the PPC types, you just kind of create this dynamic where people become uncomfortable. You don't appear to be the person who is able to take on someone like Donald Trump, because you're not necessarily being sensible on a lot of things. Now, Pierre Poilievre did pivot. He pivoted way too late, and I think that the division within the party was becoming really clear. But I want to go back to, I'm hearing the spin, and I've been hearing the spin since yesterday on the Conservatives basically saying, we got more popular vote, we've got more this, we've got more that. The only reason the Liberals won is because they got Quebec. Well, the last time I checked, there's no such thing as a participation prize for coming in second place in an election. And that constant spin that, you know what, I think the biggest winner in this entire campaign is the fact that we had a record high of voters who came out, and that number of voters voted against the Conservative Party and Pierre Poilievre. So they have a lot of soul searching to do. Me personally, as a Liberal and someone who was on the campaign, it's slightly entertaining to watch what's happening with the Tim Houstons, the Doug Fords, and even the inter-party stuff. But for a party, it's not helpful, and I think they're going to have to get themselves together at some point or another.
Let me jump off that point and ask you, Jamie. Look, I do understand, like Hannah does, the argument that there's a huge vote share, higher than they've seen since the 80s, that they did increase seats. But it does sort of take away the factors that existed last year, the way that things were supposed to go for the party. And I'm just wondering if you think that sort of as Sharon describes it, this constant thing that we basically almost won, even though we didn't, that view or that public positioning is going to take away from the ability to actually do the sort of analysis that's necessary that would lead to a win in the future. And that might include over Poilievre's own leadership.
Yeah, Vashi, I think you're kind of onto something there. I think what you're hearing right now is, frankly, a lot of spin. Everyone's just trying to win an argument today and hope people stop talking about it, and so they can kind of get on to whatever a new normal is going to be. I think there's some fairly big question marks as to what a Prime Minister Carney is going to be and how Conservatives are going to engage in the House. You heard some conciliatory messaging in terms of working with things to put Canada first, as Pierre Poilievre said on election night. And when you look at some of the platform items, you have Liberals talking about advancing pipeline resource infrastructure. You have Liberals talking about implementing a middle-class tax cut, not as big as what Conservatives were promising, but a tax cut nonetheless. And so I think if there's ways the party can advance on some of that and show that they're willing to make this minority parliament work, I think there's some ways where the Conservative Party can maybe pull the Liberal Party back to the right on their side of their spectrum and deliver real results and have the debate be whatever it's going to be based off how the next few years go and how long this parliament lasts. For the Conservative infighting stuff, I just don't think this stuff is helpful. I think there's obviously going to be a debate that's had over what went wrong and where, and and how to go about doing it. I don't think just throwing a sacrificial staff member under the bus as a sacrificial lamb to say all their problems are fixed is ultimately going to do it. I think Pierre's probably wise, frankly, to stay out of the media spotlight now for the next little bit and kind of let this conversation unfold, see who's saying what, and actually go on a bit of a listening tour to see what it is before he then comes forth and says, here, what's what I'm hearing, here's what we got wrong, and here's how I'm going to fix it. And I think when you look on some of those issues, I think he's got a real potential to kind of live this. I mean, you kind of look back to 2019 and 2021, I guess it was, when Aaron O'Toole won, there was broad-based dissatisfaction that just doesn't exist within the Conservative Party right now. There's disappointment, but generally speaking, Conservatives like Pierre Poilievre. They like what they've saw with the results, and they still have hope in him. So I think he's going to have this space and maneuverability to navigate this in a way that Andrew Scheer and Aaron O'Toole never had.
It's a good point, but we shall see, because I remember covering both of those, and it took a few weeks, but eventually the knives started coming out a little bit more publicly.
That's right.
It wasn't immediate, but I do take your point that there is a lot of support within the base, I think, for him, as evidenced by the popular support in the election.